Fellas, we're going to be trying to create the greatest UFC event of all time, and this isn't just going to be a generic card builder where we put together a few facts on a card because anybody can do that. We're going to be going through multiple different categories that makes a good pay-per-view, and looking back at the years of the UFC and different cards that we've had and picking out the best bit from different cards to try and make the best pay-per-view we can possibly make in the UFC. And we will start off with the card itself, the actual fights on the card. I think it's the most important thing, and we will be separating the main card and the prelims into two different categories, but we'll start off with the main card. If you look back in UFC history, we've had a lot of good main cards. I mean, even this year, UFC 300 had one of the best main cards I've ever seen. Pereira versus Jamal Hill. Pereira just knocking out Jamal Hill in that first round. A massive fight for the light heavyweight belt and a good build-up as well. Gaethje versus Holloway, an amazing fight followed up by one of the greatest knockouts in UFC history. Not just this year, but in UFC history. Oliveira versus Arman Tsarukyan. Again, one of the most high-level fights, at least one of the highest-level grappling fights we've seen this year. Number one contender fight. Another good fight. But I feel like UFC 300 was kind of disappointed, with all due respect, by Zhang Weili versus Yang Jianan. Again, wasn't a terrible fight, but I don't think it belongs on the greatest card in UFC history. Same for Bo Nickel and Cody Brundage. I mean, that shouldn't have even been on UFC 300. Never mind the card that I'm trying to make now. So as good as UFC 300 was in the main card, I think we can do better. Another notable card, UFC 217 a couple of years ago. 3 title fights and the main card was just amazing. Bisping versus GSP for the middleweight belt. GSP's big return. Great fight. Obviously, GSP won the belt. Garbrandt versus Dillashaw. Massive rivalry for the bantamweight belt. Again, another really good fight. Joanna Jędrzejczyk versus Rose Namajunas. Obviously, Rose Namajunas went out there and knocked her out for the strawweight belt. Another good fight. And then even the rest of the main card as well, if you take away the amazing title fights. Stephen Wonderboy Thompson versus Masvidal. Johnny Hendricks versus Paulo Costa as well. So I think UFC 217, without a doubt, had one of the best main cards. But in my personal opinion, a main card that I definitely like is, this isn't just recency bias, but I'm going to go with UFC 290. I think this has to be one of the greatest main cards in UFC history, not only because of how good the card was, but how it performed. You had Alexander Volkanovski coming back to the featherweight division after his massive fight with Makhachev the first time, and just absolutely obliterated Yair Rodriguez, got the finish as well for the featherweight belt, and that was still his last featherweight win, and this was prime Volkanovski as well. We had Moreno versus Pantoja, the beginning of Pantoja's title reign when he beat Moreno, and again, one of the best fights of 2023. This was an amazing fight across 5 rounds. The current middleweight champion, Dricus du Plessis, gets one of the biggest upsets of the year by finishing Robert Whittaker, which nobody expected to see. Dan Hooker and Jalin Turner had an absolute fight of the year contender again in an absolute war where obviously Dan Hooker got the win, and then we had Bo Nickel went out there and flatlined Val Woodburn in about 1 minute. So I'm going to go with the main card of UFC 290. I honestly think UFC 290, it was just a great main card. If you watch this, you'll understand why. It was just banger after banger, and if it wasn't a banger fight, it was just because the fight ended too early because someone had got finished. So for the main card, I'm going to go with UFC 290. And then for the prelims, I've got to give UFC 300 some more respect now. It has got the best prelims in UFC history. I mean, the prelim card from top to bottom is like no other pay-per-view we've ever seen. And I don't care if you've been watching the UFC since UFC 1 and you're going to bring up some pay-per-view from like 20 years ago that was better than this. There hasn't been any prelims better than UFC 300. I mean, from top to bottom. I mean, Yuri versus Rakic on the prelims, Sterling versus Keita, Figueiredo versus Garbrandt, Holm versus Harrison, Turner versus Moicano, Yusuf versus Lopez, all on the prelims, and I've missed out a couple of fights as well. I mean, Bobby Green and Jim Miller. I mean, there was just so many good fights on the prelims of UFC 300, which is why it's probably one of the greatest cards of all time. So for the prelims, I've got to give UFC 300 some respect. Now, I feel like if we are going to try and create the greatest card, we've got to look more closely at the main event. So I'm also going to be including a main event that we can substitute for the main card. Now, that doesn't mean I'm going to be kicking off Volkanovski versus Rodriguez. I'm going to be replacing, considering we've got Bo Nickel fighting twice against Cody Brundage, obviously for UFC 300, and Val Woodburn for UFC 290. I thought we'd get rid of one of his fights, so I'm going to be getting rid of his UFC fight. I'm going to be getting rid of his fight with Cody Brundage and just put him in down on the prelims against Val Woodburn so that we can make room for the main event. And there's been so many good main events as well. I mean, Yuri Prohaska versus Glover Teixeira. I know he also fought on UFC 300, but that was one of the greatest fights in UFC history. Usman versus Covington as well. Shogun versus Henderson. There's so many good fights that we could choose for the main event. But I'm going to go with the biggest fight in UFC history, Khabib versus Conor McGregor. I think this fight, if you saw the build-up in the fight, this fight just had everything. I mean, like I said, the build-up, the press conference, the amount of hype that was generated for this fight. There's a reason it was the biggest fight in UFC history. It had one of the best build-ups ever. And then again, just the entire aura about this fight, the build-up, just everything about the fight, the lead-up to it, the fact that the world was watching. And then the fight itself, Khabib going out there and submitting Conor McGregor, making him tap, the brawl that they had outside the octagon as well. The whole world was watching. It was a very high, one of those high-level fights in the lightweights history as well. So I've got to include McGregor versus Khabib. Was it the best fight in terms of it being an absolute war? No, like I said, the fights that I listed earlier were probably more entertaining than this, but I just think this fight had a bit of everything that made it the greatest main event of all time. So the card should be looking something like this. Headlined by Khabib and McGregor. The rest of the main card is UFC 290 without obviously Bo Nickel and Brundage. That's been moved on to the prelims with Bo Nickel and Val Woodburn, and then the UFC 300 prelims. I think this, if we combine every UFC, well, if we do a bit of mixing with UFC cards in the past, is probably one of the best cards you can put together from top to bottom if we have a bit of everything. Now, it's all good having a good card, but what venue is it going to be in? Because if it's in the Apex, the atmosphere is going to be completely gone. So I think it's important that we have a good venue. MSG is a good shout for a good venue. It's definitely one of the better ones, and there's a lot of good venues in Las Vegas. But if we're talking about the best venue, it's got to be the one we've just had, UFC 306 in the Sophia. UFC 306 on paper, I know the fights were amazing, but on paper it wasn't even that good of a pay-per-view. But because of how good the Sophia was, it just made this pay-per-view one of the most historic pay-per-views in UFC history, and it will go down in history as one of the greatest pay-per-views for the simple reason, not only because of the good fights, but for the simple reason of it being in the Sophia. It felt like a completely different atmosphere. It didn't feel like a UFC card, and I'm not saying that in a bad way. It felt surreal. It felt like we were watching a movie. Watching UFC 306 in the Sophia, it felt like the closest thing we were ever going to see to like the Gladiators or the Romans fighting. It didn't feel like the UFC. It felt like we were watching some high-end movie trailer, and I just think it by far the best venue has been the Las Vegas Sophia. We're probably not going to go there again, but it will definitely go down in UFC history for being the best venue in UFC history by a mile as well. So I think without a doubt we've got to include the Las Vegas Sophia. But again, it's all good having a good Sophia or a good venue, but what if the crowd are terrible? What if we've got some Abu Dhabi crowd just stinking up the place? So I think for the crowd, again, there's multiple options. I think the USA crowd are pretty consistent when it comes to being a good crowd. I mean, UFC 304 in London a couple of weeks ago had a really good crowd. Even Canada, for the cards that they get, they actually managed to have such a pretty good card. I think they've got an underrated crowd as well. But I'm going to go with Paris. I think Paris have the best crowd in UFC right now. I mean, you go back to the last Paris event, Cyril Gane versus Sergey Spivak, the crowd were blowing the roof off the place, and it weren't even just for the main event, but even the prelims and the first couple of fights in the Paris card, the crowd were going absolutely wild as if it was like the biggest fight in UFC history. And even before that, Cyril Gane versus Tatu Ivaza, another, just the crowd being amazing, the crowd chanting, the crowd being loud from the bottom of the card to the top. And hopefully we do see this next week when we see obviously Renato Moicano and Benoit Saint-Denis. UFC Paris crowds are there for the French fighters, and we've got a card that doesn't really have any French fighters, but I'm talking about the France as in like the passion. I know they're not going to be cheering them on if there's no French fighters. I'm talking about the passion of the French fans, the fact that they're always so loud and they're always just there from the beginning of the card to the end. That's what I mean when I talk about the French card. I know there's no French fighters on the card for them to cheer on. I'm just talking about the passion of the French fans. But what about the commentators? If you're listening to the card, if you've got it on in the background, you want to have some good commentary. So if we go through all the main commentators right now in the UFC, I'm getting rid of Dominic Cruz. If you saw Conor McGregor versus Khabib, you'll understand why I'm getting rid of Dominic Cruz. No explanation needed. I'm also going to get rid of Brendan Fitzgerald. He's not a bad commentator, but if we're trying to put together the three best commentators we can, I just don't think he fits in. I'm going to get rid of Paul Felder, one of the best commentators in the UFC in my opinion, but I think if we're trying to put together the three best commentators, I think Paul Felder's going to have to go, and I'm just going to get rid of Michael Bisping just because he's not the most reliable. Well, he's not that he's not reliable, but he's not the most consistent commentator, and I think the three we're going to go for is Rogan, Anik, and DC. I think they are the best trio when it comes to the commentary in the UFC. They just make an atmosphere of a UFC event. I know they've had bad calls in the past. They're not the most perfect commentators. They're not always the most reliable. They're not always the most consistent, but I feel like the three of them just go well together really well. Their energy together, I just think they mix together really well, and they make for a really good commentary desk. And you can tell that they're not just these commentators that are coming for a paycheck and then bouncing. They seem like genuinely passionate MMA fans who get to commentate for a living. And I just think that, like I said, the three of them, they just go together really well. They blend together really well. You've got a bit of everything from different commentators out of the three of them. So I'm going to go with Anik, DC, and Rogan for the three commentators that I've chosen. I think they are the best commentary trio in the UFC. I'm not going to pick out some wacky commentator for no reason. I'm just going to go and keep it simple. Rogan, Anik, DC, they're always there for the best pay-per-views, and I'm going to keep the similar theme here. I'm sure there's a commentator like Paul Felder who's probably less or has less bad takes, but I think if we want a bit of an atmosphere, Rogan, Anik, and DC, you can't really go wrong. And then for the main referee, I mean, the referee could be the difference between a fight, between a fight ending wrongly. I mean, they can literally change the entire outcome of a fight. So I'm not going to have Herb Dean. I feel like recently he's been extremely inconsistent, especially at UFC 306 in the main event. And I'm not going to have some, referee that's going to try and kill the fighter. I think it boils down to two referees, Mark Goddard and Jason Herzog. I think they're the two best in the UFC right now. I am going to get rid of Mark Goddard. I don't really trust him. And I know Jason Herzog had a bit of a bad call a couple couple of weeks ago when he was obviously being a referee for Cannonier versus Imavov, an extremely early stoppage. But I feel like he is the most consistent referee in the UFC. I think he does his job the best on a consistent basis, and I think he's probably one of the more reliable referees in the UFC, and I would say that he is the best referee right now in the UFC is Jason Herzog. So for the main referee throughout the card and for the main event, I am going to go with Jason Herzog being the referee. A couple extras that you could add to the card to make it even better. I mean, adding a 150k bonus, nothing can really go wrong if you add a bonus unless it's UFC 304 where they do, you know, fuck all to get the bonus. So I think adding a bonus can only make it better. No pullouts. We don't want to be having any pullouts. We don't want McGregor to be pulling out again. I know he was only pulled out once in his UFC career, but just no pullouts to save the card. And hopefully Dana isn't in a bad mood in the press conference. Hopefully Dana's not in a bad mood to the point where he starts shitting on all the fighters and cutting people left, right, and center. Hopefully we get Dana in a good mood in the press conference. So if we just recap the card, this is what the card's going to be looking like. It's going to be in the Sophia, in my opinion, the best venue, with the French fans, with obviously Anik, Rogan, and DC commentating, and with Jason Herzog as the referee. And that is how I would create the greatest UFC event of all time, the greatest UFC card of all time. Let me know your thoughts on this card, if you would have got a different route or anything, if you would have changed anything up a bit. But that is how I would personally do the card. Thank you for watching.